The development of Street Fighter 2 was nothing if not a massive undertaking for Capcom. If you've been following this channel, you know how it went back and forth on directions before we got the game we all know and love. Through this strange journey, at one point the direct sequel to the poorly aged original Street Fighter was going to take us down a very different looking alley. These included Street Fighter 89, which eventually became Final Fight. Another route went to the stars and recast Ken as a cyborg space cop, which became Street Fighter 2010 The Final Fight. And if you look past the SNK branding, you could even argue that Fatal Fury is the direct successor to Street Fighter, as the title was developed by the former Capcom employees at the head of the original iteration. All this is before we even mention the embarrassing planned British developed home computer sequel, which would become the ridiculous Human Killing Machine. Anyway, after many hurdles, eventually Capcom would decide to revise and iterate their original Versus Fighter. Still, even with a finished product we would receive, development of the title would involve going through many hoops, with Street Fighter 2, like any video game, ending up being very different to what was first drafted. So in today's upload, we are going to take a trip back through time and look at the original planned cast of fighters for this iconic game. With all of this said, hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. These are the Lost World Warriors of Street Fighter 2. Yeah! To discuss the conceptual fighters of Street Fighter 2 and its subsequent variants, we need to set a baseline of how the cast grew over the years, morphing into the legendary figures we all cherish and love. In the initial release, Street Fighter 2 would only bring 3 characters back from the first fight: Ryu and Ken, the player 1 and player 2 of the title, who would be varied up and become independent fighters, with the game opening up a player select screen. Beyond these 2 palette swaps, 6 new heroes would vary up the gameplay. These included Military Man Guile, who would match his flashy hairstyle with flash kicks and sonic booms; Sumo Wrestler Edmund Honda, who would be known for his headbutt and 100-hand slap; Dao Sim, who would fight for his village and family, stretching across the screen at a peaceful pace. Rampaging from the jungles of Brazil, we got Blanca, a green beast powered by electricity; Zangief, the Soviet Union's sent bear fighting wrestler; and lastly, the first lady of video games, Chun, who would be known for her rapid fire kicks and her designer's obsession with her muscular, nylon clad legs. Ooh. Speaking of characters, the final boss of the first game, Sagat, would return as a computer controlled boss character, but players would be surprised when defeating him that he was no longer the final challenger, but a military dictator would be your last opponent instead. Further to all of this, there's some debate about the legacy of one character. In the original game, a computer opponent named Mike, a black boxer hailing from America, who would throw down with Ryu. When Street Fighter 2 would be released in Japan, a black boxer hailing from America would throw down with your World Warrior, known as M. Bison. It's heavily speculated that these 2 characters are one and the same, and that the second game is renaming him as Mike Bison. Supposedly fearful of litigation from the heavyweight champion of the world, Mike Tyson, Capcom USA would rework the title bars of the 3 new boss characters. The Dictator would lose his title Vega and become M. Bison, the claw-wielding Spaniard would lose his appropriately Spanish-sounding name, Balrog, and become Vega, and the Boxer would take that name on and evolve into a different character. For full clarity, according to modern Capcom lore, Mike and Balrog are 2 different people, but that doesn't mean they were back in the day. Street Fighter 2 would eventually expand beyond the 6 new playable characters. Champion Edition would allow players to take control of Vega, Balrog and M. Bison for the first time, and after being the final boss in the original title, the one-eyed brawler of Thailand, Sagat, could be used by the player. Come Super Street Fighter 2 and 4, new opponents would be dubbed the New Challengers. Designed in America, DJ would bring some Jamaican variety to what amounts to Guile's moveset. T-Hawk would represent indigenous Americans and largely parallel the now Russian sensation. Fei-Long would basically be Bruce Lee. Lastly, a British special operative in a green leotard would challenge Chun-Li for sisterly supremacy. Sarah. Wait, Sarah? Found deep in the files of Super Street Fighter 2, a nameplate for a character named Sarah can be found. While there's no announced dialogue for the character, as there's only one new woman in the cast, there must be a parallel world where Capcom called the character known as Cammy as Sarah. Maybe it was for regional variants, maybe it was for a name that didn't go over well. Given that she's also gone by Killer Bee, has had one of the most significant outfit changes of the 2D Street Fighters, and even almost wore hot pants, maybe Cammy's just a girl who enjoys the variety in life. Years before the release of the new challengers though, or any iteration of Street Fighter 2 for that matter, Capcom never knew who they'd bring into the fighter. The development of the game would be very fractured between teams in Capcom. Game designer Akira Nishitani would describe this process in Polygon's oral history of the title, stating,
"I would say yes to almost everything people would bring me. Back then, there were several teams creating games at Capcom, so the teams were competing with each other, but the Street Fighter 2 team was also competing amongst itself. The programmers and artists were each working on their own characters, which led to a lot of rivalries. You know, my character's gonna be better than yours." Because of that, they'd each come up with crazy ideas and bring them to me. And I didn't want to tell them, that won't fit with our game system, so you should do something else. Or, that idea is too crazy, you should come up with something less over the top. I didn't want to discourage their creativity, so I said, okay, cool, I'll make that happen, and come up with more crazy ideas and I'll make those happen too.
James Goddard, who would eventually work with Capcom on the follow-ups, and also function as a guest speaker in my T-Hawk video I might add, explained how the iconic fighters would find themselves attached to players. He states,
"I just think it really resonated with people because they could be the character they wanted to be. It was like something out of a kung fu movie where you have all these guys do weird things."
In 1992, Capcom would release a combination artbook and soundtrack for the title, the Street Fighter 2 Complete File, which would later be reproduced in part in the Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection. In this book, we would see a number of preliminary versions of characters, with the following aspects leading into what we'd eventually see. These included a Chinese beauty, Zi Li, a Kempo prodigy. With her hair in buns, she would be fighting to find the killer of her father, Jen from the first game, who would later appear in Alpha. When you mention Chinese and a beautiful woman chasing down her father's killer, the through line is clear. Zi Li would eventually become Chun-Li, the first lady of fighting games. If Zi Li was a bit of a reductive Chinese stereotype, and a baby would be an outright offensive caricature. Officially described as a beast man raised by lions, who is proficient at biting and scratching, but is extremely weak to fire, he's subservient to his manager and tamer, Rothenberger, and would be known for his Beastman attack special move. Yikes. It's a good thing that Capcom eventually moved away from the caricature and turned a Beastman concept up to 11, by swapping his skin colour to green and adding a bit of electricity to his moveset. Yes, Blanca, who was even called Hammer Blanca at one point in production, is definitely a glow up for what would have been one of the worst decisions Capcom could have made. There's a potential that Rothenberger could be related to the Bullfighter character, who's also been known as Zubaz, based on his shirt saying as much. Dressed somewhere between a cowboy, the Road Warriors, and well, a stereotypical bear you're likely to find in a club instead of a forest. This character somewhat stands out. But hey, as a man who both wrestles men and also rocks a full beard, game recognises game. Yeah. Bullfighter would have engaged in battle with a whip. Online fans have found the Bullfighter to be a very interesting character, and there's an argument that Shovel Knight's Baz may have been a reference to him. Bullfighter may have evolved into a masked holy warrior, who then evolved into a claw fighter known as Balrog in Japan, Vega elsewhere. If the Bullfighter is a bit flamboyant, Masaki Kakuda may have been a bit too bland. This generic looking karate fighter could and looks to have been simply replaced by the dual returning characters of Ryu and Ken. If Masaki was to make it to the game, he looks like he would have been a stern and angrier fighter, in comparison to the relatively youthful energy that the students of Goken would have. While the Bullfighter may have been dressed a fair amount like the Road Warriors, Tahiya would actually be the first attempt at adding a wrestler to the franchise. Decked out in a star on his mask, the lone art isn't coloured. Could it be a white star on a blue background implying a bit of an American edge? A yellow star on a red flag may make a bit more sense. As we know, in 2023, the only wrestler that would join Street Fighter 2 would be the Soviet suplexer Zangief. It's likely that Tahir evolved into Vodka Galbolski, who then turned into Zangief. The Great Tiger at first glance could easily have been a rough draft of Dalsim. Wearing a turban, Great Tiger would have had the ability to double jump in battle. Given that the Punch-Out fighter already claimed that name and much of the visual styling, Capcom then shifted into a Ganesh-inspired form of Naradatta, before eventually just outright ripping off Yogi Trolli Sung from the movie Master of the Flying Guillotine, a stretchy Indian who could reach across the battlefield. For a military figure, Shilk Mullah is a former Green Beret with spiky, light-coloured hair and can be seen licking a knife. Clearly, this would evolve into the American soldier Guile, swapping out a knife for a stylish comb and angry rage over the death of his old partner. For some reason, he was named after an East German athlete, who is known as one of the best female sprinters in the world, which is somewhat bizarre to say the least. Bun Bobo would simply be known as a capoeira fighter. While I have seen DJ's fighting style described perhaps as capoeira in the past, Capcom would not really revisit this concept until the drastically different Alina in Street Fighter 3, but to great success, as part of the glory that is the art style of Street Fighter 3 is how fluid and smooth Alina's movement is. Without much to go on, Bun Bobo is more of a bum no-go for the franchise. Lastly, an American boxer would be included in the game, but he wouldn't be Mike, or Balrog, or any other combination of the two, but a white fighter named Dick Jumpsy, a play on Jack Dempsey, a professional boxer known as Kid Blackie and the Manasseh Moolah. Dick potentially could have been dropped for a returning Mike, who was then replaced or fleshed out into M. Bison, eventually Balrog in the English markets. Hey, it's all speculation and all we're really going off is old sketches and foggy memories, but it's fun to go back and look at such a legendary game in some of its earliest stages nonetheless. Now, I doubt many of you there are saddened by the lack of any of these unrefined original concepts making the final cut, but I'd still love to hear your thoughts on which early design is your favourite and why. Anyway, if you'd like to see even weirder abandoned character designs, check out my video on the lost challenges of Street Fighter 3 right now. Cheerio!